Alabama, 1856. A quiet plantation, a family bound by wealth and power, until the unthinkable happens. Two sons of the master are struck down, not by rebellion in the fields or by armed uprising, but by poisoned gifts. A gesture of kindness turned into a silent weapon. Behind this chilling act was a slave whose courage, or desperation, rewrote the balance of power in the most intimate and terrifying way possible. What would drive someone to such a dangerous act of revenge? If stories like this captivate you, hit that like button, subscribe for more hidden histories, and share this video with someone who loves unraveling the past. Every click helps bring forgotten voices back to life. Chapter 1. A tenth South in 1856. The year was 1856, and Alabama stood like a pressure cooker on the edge of explosion. The cotton fields stretched endlessly, green seas rolling under the heavy southern sun. To outsiders, the wealth of the South seemed untouchable, built on sprawling plantations and the promise of prosperity. But beneath that picture of abundance was something far darker. The system of slavery that chained nearly 500,000 people in Alabama alone. Every harvest, every brick of those grand plantation houses, every luxury enjoyed by the wealthy few came at the cost of human suffering. Politically, the country was fractured. Just a few years earlier, the Fugitive Slave Act had tightened its grip, forcing even northern states to return escaped slaves to their so-called owners. Abolitionist voices were growing louder in the North, newspapers carrying fiery headlines, while Southern leaders doubled down on defending slavery as a necessary institution. In the halls of Congress, arguments over new territories, would they be slave or free, erupted into shouting matches and even violence. The nation was clearly heading toward a storm, but in 1856, no one yet knew just how close the Civil War loomed. For the enslaved, life in Alabama was suffocating. Families were torn apart at auction blocks. Women were vulnerable to abuse, and men faced brutal labor under the watchful eye of overseers. Even moments of rest carried the weight of fear of punishment, of separation, of the unrelenting cruelty that defined the system. And yet beneath this crushing oppression, there burned a quiet defiance. Small acts of resistance, songs sung in coded language, work slowed by deliberate carelessness, food shared in solidarity, became the threads of survival. It was within this tense, divided South that one plantation's story would take a shocking turn. Chapter 2. Life on the plantation. A plantation was more than land and cotton. It was a carefully constructed machine, designed to keep every person in their place. The master controlled wealth and authority, but he didn't run this world alone. His wife often oversaw the domestic sphere, directing the enslaved women who cooked, cleaned, and raised children not their own. The overseer enforced the labor, ensuring not a single back slackened under the hot sun. Even the sons of the household learned young what power meant. They were taught to see human lives as part of their inheritance. For the enslaved, the line between survival and punishment was razor thin. A spilled drink, a missed chore, a few ounces of cotton short of quota, any of it could invite the lash. Work in the fields was unrelenting, dawn bells, aching backs, and endless rows stretching toward the horizon. But inside the big house, life wasn't easier, just different. Domestic slaves lived closer to the family, forced into roles that blurred servitude with intimacy. They were present at meals and bedrooms in the very heart of the household. That closeness made them both invisible and exposed, witnesses to everything, yet powerless to change it. Still, behind lowered eyes and hushed tones, enslaved people nurtured their own hidden world. A stolen smile, a song hummed soft enough to escape the overseer's ear, recipes passed down in whispers, fragments of African traditions carried across oceans and kept alive in secret. These acts weren't grand rebellions, but they were rebellions nonetheless. Proof that the spirit could bend without breaking. This daily dance of submission and survival shaped the lives of everyone on the plantation. And as the master's sons grew into their roles, the fragile balance between power and resentment began to tilt toward something far more dangerous. Chapter 3. The Master and His Sons. Every plantation had its ruling family, and on this Alabama estate in 1856, that family's presence dominated every life within its borders. The master was a man steeped in entitlement, his authority reinforced not just by land deeds and wealth, but by the belief that slavery was his God-given right. He was stern, proud, and like many of his peers, saw himself less as a villain and more as a patriarch keeping order. In truth, his power rested on violence and fear. The master's wife mirrored this authority in quieter ways. Though not always wielding the whip, she upheld the system, demanding loyalty from the enslaved people who worked under her watch. Meals had to be perfect, clothing spotless, floors shining. If expectations weren't met, punishments followed. Even children in the household grew up absorbing this hierarchy, learning early that their comfort came at someone else's suffering. And then there were the sons, youths raised with privilege, pride, and a dangerous sense of invulnerability. They had grown up watching their father's dominance, watching the overseer's lash cut through the air, watching enslaved people bow their heads in submission. For them, cruelty and power were lessons learned at the dinner table. Accounts of these particular sons describe arrogance, the careless entitlement of boys who believed themselves untouchable. They laughed at those who served them, demanded obedience without hesitation, and reveled in their small displays of control. To the enslaved, the sons were not just heirs, they were daily reminders of the cycle of oppression stretching into the next generation. And yet, as fate would have it, these very sons would become the unexpected weak point in the master's fortress of power. Not through rebellion in the fields, but through a quiet, calculated act that no one could have predicted. Chapter 4. A slave with silent resolve. History rarely records the names of the enslaved who resisted. And in this case, the records are thin, scattered, and often told from the master's perspective. But even in fragments, a picture emerges, not of a faceless servant, but of a person carrying silent resolve. To live enslaved meant enduring humiliation, labor, and constant fear, yet beneath that crushing weight, people still nurtured their own inner lives. The individual at the center of this tale was not described as reckless. Instead, whispers suggest patience, observation, and a mind attuned to opportunity. In the shadows of the household, this person saw things others overlooked: where food was stored, how the family trusted gifts, the blind spots and routines that had never been challenged. These small details, gathered quietly, could one day become weapons. It's difficult to imagine the mix of emotions driving such a choice. Was it rage from years of suffering, grief over loved ones sold away, a sense of justice, however dangerous, burning brighter than fear? For an enslaved person, taking direct action against the master's family was almost certain death. Yet sometimes survival alone wasn't enough. Sometimes the weight of injustice demanded more than silence. The enslaved often carried knowledge underestimated by their masters. They worked the kitchens, mixed herbs, and tended fields of plants with properties both nourishing and deadly. To white eyes, they were uneducated laborers. In truth, they were keepers of ancestral knowledge, medicines, remedies, and poisons passed down across generations. It was in this hidden knowledge, combined with the will to strike, that the seeds of rebellion quietly grew. This act would not roar like a battle. It would whisper like a secret, carried in the form of a gift. Chapter 5. The poisoned gifts. On the surface, a gift is an act of kindness, a small token wrapped in the ordinary rituals of daily life. For the master's sons, receiving such a gesture from someone in the household likely seemed harmless, perhaps even flattering. But in 1856 Alabama, that simple act concealed something far deadlier. The enslaved person at the center of this story chose a weapon that didn't require open defiance or brute force. Instead, it relied on subtlety, patience, and the quiet trust the family had in their position. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: lace the gifts with poison, transform generosity into a silent strike. Poison was a weapon enslaved people sometimes turned to, precisely because it inverted the power dynamic. Masters could lock away weapons, monitor movements, even chain bodies, but they still had to eat. They still accepted drinks, food, and small offerings from the very people they enslaved. Every bite, every sip, was a hidden opportunity. The exact substance used in this case isn't clearly recorded. But in the mid-19th century South, knowledge of herbs was widespread among enslaved communities. Plants like nightshade, Jimson weed, or even ground glass mixed into food could cause symptoms that baffled physicians of the time. What masters dismissed as harmless folk knowledge often contained a dangerous edge. The poisoned gifts were handed over without suspicion. The sons, accustomed to entitlement, likely never considered that danger could be so close. They might have smiled, even mocked the gesture, before consuming what would soon seal their fate. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. Quietly, invisibly, but irreversibly. A calculated act of resistance had been set in motion, and the poison was already coursing through. Chapter 6. The shocking deaths at first, there was no reason to suspect anything unusual. The master's sons carried on as they always did, laughing, boasting, issuing commands with careless authority. But then subtle cracks began to appear. A sudden tightness in the chest, a wave of nausea that bent them double, a burning in the stomach that no drink of water could quench. In the 19th century, illness was common, and sudden sickness could strike without warning. Fevers, infections, and dysentery often swept through households. But this was different. The timing was too precise, the symptoms too sharp. The sons, who just hours before seemed invincible, now writhed in pain under the bewildered gaze of their family. Panic spread quickly. Doctors were summoned, their horse-drawn carriages rushing to the plantation gates. Remedies of the era, bleeding, purging, and herbal tonics, were applied in frantic succession. But nothing helped. Each hour brought fresh agony, until the young men's strength drained away entirely. Within days, the master's household was plunged into mourning. The shock was immense. The death of a son was tragedy enough, but two, struck down in such a mysterious and brutal way. It was as if fate itself had turned against the family. In reality, fate had nothing to do with it. This was a deliberate act, carried out from within their own walls. For the enslaved, whispers ran like fire in the night. Some grieved quietly. Death was still death, no matter whose. Others felt a forbidden surge of vindication. To see the untouchable brought low was dangerous even to imagine. Yet here it was, unfolding before their very eyes. The master's household had been breached. And with grief came suspicion, a suspicion that would soon spread like poison itself. Chapter 7. Suspicion and fear-grief quickly curdled into suspicion. The deaths of the master's sons were too sudden, too inexplicable for the family to accept them as chance. Behind the drawn curtains of the plantation house, whispers of poison began to circulate. Who could have done such a thing? Who had been close enough to strike? All eyes turned toward the enslaved. After all, they were the ones who cooked the meals, prepared the drinks, tended the home. To the master's mind, trust had been shattered. Every familiar face, a servant he had known for years, a worker who had tended his field since childhood, suddenly looked like a possible traitor. Fear rippled outward. Overseers tightened their grip, punishments grew harsher, and the enslaved community felt the weight of suspicion pressing down like a storm. Rumors of interrogations spread, threats, lashings, perhaps even executions, designed not just to find a culprit, but to terrify anyone who might consider following the same path. But fear was not one-sided. Among the masters and overseers, there was a gnawing anxiety. If this could happen once, it could happen again. Poison was invisible, undetectable until it was too late. Every sip of water, every bite of bread, carried with it the shadow of doubt. Suddenly, the very foundation of their control, that enslaved people would remain submissive, seemed less certain. The enslaved themselves were caught in a cruel paradox. Many may not have known who carried out the act, but they all bore the risk of its consequences. One person's resistance could bring punishment to dozens, even hundreds. Yet at the same time, the act lit a spark, a reminder that the masters were not untouchable, that even in silence, resistance had teeth. The search for justice or vengeance was about to begin. Chapter 8. Justice or Retribution. In the antebellum South, justice was never blind. When enslaved people stood accused, the outcome was rarely in doubt. The deaths of the master's sons demanded a response, and that response would not be guided by fairness or evidence. It would be driven by rage. Records from incidents like these often describe swift, brutal proceedings. Sometimes trials were held, but they were little more than performances, staged to legitimize punishment. The accused slave would stand alone before a panel of white men, judges, planters, politicians, all invested in upholding the system that gave them power. Witnesses from the enslaved community were rarely trusted. Their voices were muted, their words dismissed. In many cases, the evidence was circumstantial. Proximity to the kitchen, a strange look noticed days earlier, even a rumor whispered in fear. But the outcome was predictable. The punishment had to be public, not only to avenge the sons, but to send a message. Retribution could be swift and merciless. Some accused of poisoning were hanged, their bodies displayed as warnings. Others were burned alive or executed by firing squads assembled on the plantation grounds. These punishments were as much theater as they were vengeance, designed to crush defiance before it spread. And yet even in such brutality, the act could not be undone. The sons remained dead, the family shattered, and whispers of the deed echoed through enslaved quarters across the South. The enslaved person who struck this blow, whether caught or forever hidden in silence, had carved their name, however faintly, into the ledger of resistance. To the masters, it was retribution. To the enslaved, it was both terror and a grim reminder. Even under the harshest chains, defiance could still find a way. Chapter 9. The Legacy of Resistance. The story of poisoned gifts in Alabama was not an isolated act. Across the South, enslaved people resisted in countless ways, some small, some explosive. Most forms of defiance were quiet, working slowly, breaking tools, feigning illness, or preserving African traditions in song and story. These acts, though subtle, were powerful. They kept identity alive in a world determined to erase it. But sometimes resistance turned sharper. Poisoning was one of the most feared tactics among slaveholders. From Virginia to Louisiana, scattered records tell of enslaved people accused of slipping toxins into meals or drinks. For masters, the possibility was terrifying. It meant that the very people they relied on for daily survival could turn household routines into weapons. Other acts of open rebellion punctured the myth of control. Gabriel's rebellion in 1800, Denmark Vesey's planned uprising in 1822, and Nat Turner's revolt in 1831 all left deep scars on the Southern psyche. Though many such revolts were crushed, they proved that submission was never absolute. Enslaved people dreamed of freedom, and sometimes they acted on those dreams no matter the cost. The Alabama poisoning fits into this lineage of defiance. It may not have been a rebellion of hundreds, but its impact was no less profound. It revealed vulnerability at the heart of the plantation system. It showed that resistance could strike not in distant battlefields, but in the master's own dining room, hidden in the very food he trusted. For enslaved communities, these stories carried both fear and inspiration. Fear, because the punishments were brutal. Inspiration, because they proved that courage could exist even in the darkest corners of oppression. The legacy of resistance was not only in what was done, but in the memory that it was possible. Chapter 10. Echoes through history. The tale of the poisoned gifts in Alabama. 1856 lingers not because it changed the course of the Civil War, but because it reminds us of the fragile line between power and vulnerability. For generations, slavery was built on the illusion of control, an entire society convinced that chains and whips could suppress human will. Yet stories like this shatter that illusion. They reveal that even in the most suffocating systems, cracks always formed. To some, this is a tale of crime, a servant striking down the innocent sons of a master. To others, it is a story of justice, twisted and desperate, born from centuries of cruelty. In truth, it is both. History rarely gives us clean lines of right and wrong, especially when viewed from the depths of oppression. What remains undeniable is that acts like this forced Americans to confront the brutality that lay beneath their wealth and privilege. The Civil War would erupt just 5 years later, tearing the nation apart over the very question of slavery. Millions would suffer, fight, and die before emancipation was declared. And while the name of the enslaved person who carried out this act may be lost, the echo of their defiance endures. It speaks not only to the violence of the system, but to the resilience of those trapped within it. Today, remembering such stories isn't about glorifying violence. It's about refusing to let silence erase them. These echoes remind us that history isn't just dates and battles. It's choices made by individuals, often in the shadows, that reveal the raw human struggle for dignity and freedom. The poisoned gifts of Alabama are long gone, but their message still whispers. Even the powerless can find a way to strike back, and that's the story of the poisoned gifts in Alabama. 1856, a tale of power, defiance, and echoes that still shape how we remember the past. If this story moved you, take a second to hit like, subscribe for more hidden histories, and share it with someone who loves uncovering the untold. Your support helps keep these voices alive.